Okay? Everybody should silence their computers. This week we start the book of Devarim. And the opening of Devarim begins with words of admonishment, words of rebuke. Moshe Rabbeinu has been involved with us for 40 years. Moshe was the Redeemer chosen by God to take the Jews out of Egypt. And from that time going forward for 40 years, Moshe Rabbeinu was the dedicated shepherd of the Jewish people. And he went through thick and thin with us. There are many moments of defiance. There were moments where we were on the brink of destruction because of our misbehavior. And he always intervened, dedicated, always to do his best to save the day and have us reinstated. And he was always able to activate the attribute of mercy. Despite the moment being the most intense level of justice, he was able to somehow massage it and reinstate the attribute of mercy. So Moshe now, these are the last 36 days of Moshe's life. The Talmud tells us that if you want to compare Joshua, who's the successor of Moshe, who was chosen by God to be a successor, to Moshe, so the Talmud says, Pnei Moshe ki pnei Chamo. The face of Moshe was like the light of the sun, was like the sun. Pnei Yeshua ki pnei Levana. Joshua was what? Was like the moon reflects the light of the sun, and it pales compared to what the sun is. It's only a reflection of the sun. Identically, Yeshua, being the mentored by his teacher, Moshe Rabbeinu, was only a semblance of his teacher. She's compared to the light of the moon. So the leadership of Moshe far surpassed whatever the leadership of Yeshua was. Nevertheless, Yeshua was qualified to take them into the promised land, to conquer the land, to divide the land to a point. That was Joshua. The Jews did not go astray with idolatry until after the Pesach of Yeshua. That was the level of his leadership. And he was able to keep them in tow as he did. But nothing's compared to Moshe Rabbeinu. And Moshe Rabbeinu, in the book of Devarim, he reviews everything he had taught them until this point, plus a few extra laws. And that's why the book of Devarim is referred to as Mishneh Torah. It's a repetition of the Torah. The fifth book encompasses everything that was stated previously, plus a little bit more. But it's introduced with words of admonishment, of rebuke. Why? As I said, it's the last 36 days of Moshe's life. Moshe Rabbeinu, when he speaks to the Jewish people, the impact and the effect is one of a kind. And he lived through everything which he's rebuking them about. So nobody could say, it never happened. It happened. He was there to witness it and experience it with them. And he was, as I said, and he was essential to pull us out of that morass, the most difficult moments. And we're here today only because of Moshe's leadership. Why does one give Musar? Why does one give rebuke? It's just to find fault. To show you who you're not. Or the value of admonishment, which was Moshe's value of this rebuke, was to put us in touch with our vulnerabilities that in the past we failed. Why did we fail? We failed because of the moment, a lack of clarity. We were overwhelmed with a level of insecurity, whatever the reason we failed. But as King Solomon says, what was is, and what is will be. We re-experience many things in life. What's the value of history? You learn from history, the mistakes of the past, hopefully are not going to be repeated. Unfortunately, people don't learn from the past. And because we don't learn from the past, we repeat the mistakes of the past in the present and the future. Moshe Rabbeinu is trying to communicate with a level of clarity or a level of love and commitment and concern that we should appreciate why he's telling us this. And it's very interesting. The first verse of Devarim, the way he communicates it, it's all on an illusionary level. He doesn't hit a square between the eyes. He alludes to certain things of the past where he knows we understand what he's talking about. Of course, he's not here to embarrass us. He's not here to give us a guilt conscience. He's here for one reason, to make us aware we have Achilles heels, we have vulnerabilities, and he doesn't want us to repeat the mistakes of the past. It's in our best interest. And as a result of that, we'll be receptive, because everything he says is undeniable. Everything he says is on target. And everything he says is with that level of concern and love for the Jewish people. Therefore, we're touched differently. We're touched to the core of our being. And hopefully, it will resonate with every one of us that we go forward, that Musar will have its unlimited level of value, not to repeat the same mistakes. That's number one. That's why the last 36 days of his life, his introductory statement is recounting the past, from the time we left Egypt until the present moment. Every level of failing, that's one thing. Nachmanides adds, if a person is always prone to fail, we had mentioned the Midrash that initially God wanted to create the world with the attribute of justice, exactness. Why didn't he? Why did he coalesce into creation the attribute of mercy? Because since man is prone to fail, if God would exercise the attribute of mercy, man doesn't have a chance to survive. And since man is prone to fail, there has to be mercy. So mercy is for the best interest of mankind. That's why he coalesced mercy. So initially we find at the time of creation, the appellation of Elokim, which is the attribute of mercy, of justice. And then when he creates man, it's Hashem Elokim. Yud Kei Vav Kei, the four-letter name of God, connotes the attribute of mercy. Because that's in the best interest of the human being. God has to be merciful. Because we have choice, and unfortunately, most times we don't choose properly, or even if we do, we fall short of what we should be doing. Okay? Now, when Moshe Rabbeinu, while he's rebuking us, simultaneously, we realize, although we failed, somehow God allowed us to continue. God forgave us. It's as much as we may have had pain and we were punished, but we made it through. We're here. We've arrived. We're about ready to cross the Jordan. So meaning what's crucial and key in every one of a person's mind is this hope. Even if we fail, this hope. Because if a person would see it's hopeless, man says, there's no rhyme or reason, there's no point. What's the point of investing if ultimately it's all going to collapse? It's all going to collapse. So therefore God, by Moshe reviewing and recounting the past, how we failed so seriously, and despite that God forgave us, which displays continuously God's attribute of mercy, that gives us hope for the future. That even if we fail in the future, what kind of God do we have? As much as every aspect of our behavior is on record, but simultaneously he's merciful. And because he's merciful, we go forward and we could succeed despite our shortcomings. And the Ramban writes, David Melch writes in Tehillim, in Psalms, that Ki imcha slicha lamanti vorei. It's Psalm 130, verse 4. Ki imcha slicha. Forgiveness is with you, God, for the sake that we should have fear of you, so that we should revere you. Meaning, if we fail, it's hopeless. What's the point? Might as well make the best of it. You know, a person is a thief, and if he's caught, he's going to spend 500 years in prison. He's not going to have a life. A person might as well continue committing crimes because his state is a hopeless state. So why does a person fear God and revere God? Knowing that regardless how much as we fail, God is always forgiving. If we're sincere that we want to make corrections, that's a basis that is a future. But if ultimately you can never be forgiven, might as well make the best of it. So David says, Ki imcha slicha, because forgiveness is in your hands, God. That's why people revere and fear you. But if there's no chance, what's the point? Just might as well make the best of it and cross as many lines as you can before you stopped and put out a commission. These are the words of Nachmanides. That is the value of Moshe's giving Musar, admonishing, rebuking the Jews, and going continuously, recounting, reiterating to us what we have to hear. But how does he do it? He does it with a tremendous level of consideration. He's not here to embarrass us. That he's stroking our guilt conscience. He's not doing that. That's not the point. So some people, when you want something out of them, you give them a guilt trip to extract what you want to get out of them. Moshe Rabbeinu here is not touching that raw nerve of guilt at all. He's only recounting the past to be able to bring us to a level of understanding that we should not fail again. That's the value. And therefore, when he says it to us, it's only on an illusionary level rather than directly, explicitly, and openly. To show he's concerned for our self-respect. Words of the book of Devarim is Eile HaDvarim. These are the words. If you take a look at the word Eile HaDvarim, contained in those two words, you have the word Dvarim, words, and you have the word, if you add the Hey, you have HaDvarim, the words, and then if you add the Eile, these are the words. So within those two words, there's a reference to three statements of words: Dvarim, Hadvarim, and Eile Hadvarim. What is it referring to? So there's a beautiful Balaturin over here. He writes At Sinai, God communicated the Torah to Moshe Rabbeinu, and Moshe communicated to us. After the sin of the golden calf, Moshe again, there was new covenant. It was in the community. It was in the Ol Moed. Moshe Rabbeinu communicated the Torah to us again in the Ol Moed. Now that we're in the plains of Moab, before Moshe Rabbeinu passes away a third time, he communicates the Torah its entirety to us. Each time the Torah is communicated to us, God enters into a covenant with us, and we enter a covenant with God. And each covenant, each mitzvah, and the Talmud discusses this, the 16 covenants on the Torah its entirety. Each time it's given over to us. 16 covenants the first time it's communicated to us, 16 covenants the second time, 16 covenants the third time. What is the significance of the 16 times 3? That means altogether there are 48 covenants, which the Torah is secured, that we're bound to the Torah. We agree to enter into this covenant. We're bound inextricably with God in these 16 covenants times 3. 48 times, 48 covenants. He points out idolatry is mentioned 48 times in the Torah. 48 times. The convert who converts to Judaism, the laws which pertain to the convert are mentioned 48 times in the Torah. So again, 48 covenants for the Torah. Idolatry is mentioned 48 times in the Torah. And the laws pertaining to the convert who converts to Judaism, various laws pertaining to him are mentioned 48 times in the Torah. What is the significance of this? So he explains, when the convert chooses to become a Jew, what is he doing? He's leaving idolatry to become part of the Jewish people, to take upon himself the yoke of Torah. So he left the 48 to him to become part of the 48. That is the significance of 48 times idolatry, 48 times Torah, covenant-wise, and the ger, the convert, 48 times, he's the person who chose to leave the 48, which represents idolatry, to become part of the 48, which represents Torah. These are the words of the Baal HaTurim. We find that Yisro, who was the father of Moshe Rabbeinu, he had a number of names. One of the names was Chovav. Chovav, that was one of the names of Yisro. So the Midrash tells us, why was Yisro called Chovav? In Hebrew, the word l'chavev means to adore. Something you love. Chiba means love. Another word for love. Yisro left his glory in Midian, and he went out into the desert to become part of the Jewish people, to accept the Torah. So it's only because he had this all-consuming love for Torah, therefore he abandoned his glory in Midian to become part of the Jewish people. Shechiviv is a Torah. Yisro sends a message to his son-in-law Moshe that he's coming with his wife, Moshe's wife, because she wasn't in Egypt, to witness the 10 plagues, and his 2 children. She says, I'm coming myself with your wife and your 2 children. What does he have to delineate the 3 segments of who's coming? Himself, his wife, and his children. So the Midrash tells us, and Rashi cites this in his commentary, if you want to come out to greet me, you could come out in my honor. And if you don't want to come out to acknowledge me for my honor, come out to acknowledge your wife, Tzipporah. And if you don't want to come out to acknowledge your wife Tzipora, you should come out to acknowledge your two sons who are coming to become part of you, your family. Chazal tell us the greatest honor that was ever offered to a human being in the history of the world was Yaakov when he came to Egypt, and when Yisro had come, leaving Midian, come into the desert. Why? Yosef was the viceroy of Egypt. He was more powerful than the Pharaoh. When Yosef heard that his father was coming, it says he hitched his chariot and he went out to greet his father. So the Midrash says, when Yosef went out to greet his father, don't you think that all the courtiers of the court of Pharaoh, don't you think they went out right behind Yosef to greet Yosef's father? If the courtiers went out, don't you think the masses of Egypt went out? So who went out to greet Yaakov when he came to Egypt? Every Egyptian in Egypt went to greet Yaakov coming to Egypt. In the history, there was never such a level of honor accorded to a human being as Yaakov. Moshe Rabbeinu was the ultimate. If Moshe Rabbeinu goes out to greet Yisro, don't you think Aaron and his children are coming? Don't you think the elders of Egypt, of the Jewish people, are coming behind Aaron and his sons? Don't you think the 12 tribes are coming behind the elders to greet Yisro? So therefore, the honor according to Yisro was the greatest honor ever accorded to a human being, besides Yaakov in the history of existence. It's the Medrash. So what was the question? If Moshe goes out to greet Yisro, what does that mean? Moshe understands the ramifications of that. Aaron and his sons are going to follow, the elders are going to follow, and all the Jews are going to follow. So millions of people are going to go greet Yisro in the desert. Who was Yisro? What was his back, his past? He was the high priest of Midian. He was an idolater. It wasn't so simple. You know, this may touch people differently. Maybe it'd be the wrong thing to greet Yisro because of his checkered past. And Yisro understood that. And he was okay with that. He says, if you don't come out to greet me, come out to greet your wife. But your wife is my daughter. My wife was born a pagan. Your wife was born a pagan. You should come out for your children. The Torah tells us he went out to greet Yisro for Yisro. Why? So the Midrash tells us, Hashem says to Moshe, you shouldn't hesitate. You should go out to greet Yisro for Yisro. Why? Because you know what Yisro did? He abandoned idolatry because of the love that he had for my Torah. He gave it all up for my Torah. Therefore, he deserves that level of honor. That's what Hashem says to Moshe. And it says, Vayetze Yisro, Moshe likros chosno Moshe, chosro Yisro. Moshe went out to greet his father-in-law, for his father-in-law's sake. Why do you have idolatry mentioned 48 times in the Torah? And then the convert mentioned 48 times in the Torah. And the Torah having 48 covenants, because the convert turned his back on idolatry to become part of the Jewish people, which is Torah. Therefore, he's special. That's why it's mentioned 48 times. It's a monumental task, accomplishment, to leave that to become part of the Jewish people. Therefore, it's mentioned 48 times, all the laws which pertain to the convert. We read in the last chapter of Pirkei Avos that for the acquisition of Torah in its totality, you have to meet 48 criteria. 48 criteria. Otherwise, you're not able to encompass the Torah in its totality. Memches Devarim shehaTorah niknas behem. The 48 ways to acquire the Torah in its entirety. So Where do we come up with number 48? The 48 ways, that corresponds to the 48 covenants which Hashem had made that inextricably were connected to Torah. Torah itself is essential to the development of the Jewish soul. That means if God chose 48 covenants, that means to acquire it in its totality, you have to meet 48 criteria to be able to achieve that level of acquisition. There it's 48. But why is idolatry mentioned 48 times? The Gemara tells us, Talmud tells a number of occasions, Barasi Yitzhar Barasi Torah Tavlin. The only antidote to the evil inclination is the Torah itself. The Torah incapacitates the influence of the evil inclination. If idolatry is mentioned 48 times, that tells us the counterforce to Torah is 48. So how do you fight fire? You fight fire with fire. The evil inclination is fire. Idolatry is the ultimate denial of God's existence. God is not the echod. He's not the omnipotent being. There are other powers that exist outside of God. That's 48. So how do you bring a level of clarity to refute that, to dispel that it shouldn't be a consideration for a moment? The Torah itself, which is represented through 48 covenants, that confirms that the only way to deal with the evil inclination, which is rooted in idolatry, which is a denial of God's unity, is through the Torah itself. So how do we come upon God's unity? To appreciate that, to embrace it and internalize it to our best ability, despite where we're at. It's through the Torah itself. He says something interesting, the Balaturim. He says, if you take the last letters of Bereshis, the first book of the Torah school is Bereshis. It's a tough. And the second book is called Shmos. And the first word is Ve'ele. That word ends with a Hey. The third book is called Vayikra, Leviticus. The first word ends with an Aleph. Bamidbar, the last word it opens Vayedaber. God spoke to us in Midbar Sinai. It ends with a Reish. And the last letter of this book is Eile. It ends with a Hey. If you add up all those letters, the numerical value is Yiras. Yiras. What does Yiras means? Fear. It alludes to the pasuk Reishis Chochma Yiras Hashem. What's the prerequisite to the Torah itself? The fear of God. The Torah's entirety, the last letter of every one of the first words of each of the books, numerically is Yiras, to tell us what is the basis, and it's the beginning of each one of these books combined. The prerequisite to acquire these books, which is the Torah's entirety, is Yiras, the fear of God. Reishis Chochem Yiras Hashem. And the word Yiras is the same numerical value as Torah. Yiras and Torah are the same numerical value. They go hand in hand. One cannot be without the other. This is all in the Balaturim. So we correspond 48, 48. The convert 48. Yiras is the beginning, the end of every word, first word of each one of the books. Numerically, it's Yiras. David says, Reishis Chochma Yiras Hashem. The prerequisite for Chochma, for the ultimate wisdom, is fear of God. And the numerical value of Yiras is Torah. It's synonymous. One doesn't go without the other. There's a midrash. We have a positive inclination, we have a negative inclination. When a child is born as a minor, the child's born as unintelligible. Intelligence doesn't work. And so therefore, but physically, the physicality, what drives the child, why the child functions, it's within all the physical. So the original years, the formative years of a child as a minor, really the overwhelming influence is physical. And therefore, the evil inclination has the upper hand immediately. The conditioning process of that child is physical. It's a material conditioning. According to one midrash, the positive inclination only enters into the child at the age of bar mitzvah. Until the age of bar mitzvah, the child is under the influence of the evil inclination. Why? So the midrash says, because if we would start off at equal footing, the evil inclination, positive inclination, the evil inclination would never have any influence over the human being. It's only because the evil inclination has a 13-year head start of negative conditioning on the child, drawing the child to physicality and playing into all the physical inclinations. Therefore, it's a monumental accomplishment now to undo that conditioning, which is all physical. Because if we would start off at the same moment, equal footing, and you would show one versus the other, the evil inclination, what it offers, wouldn't even be considered whatsoever. I'll give you an example. A person was brought up to eat only healthy, never knew what it meant to eat unhealthy. And that's the conditioning of the child into adulthood. And then somebody goes and eats something. To that person, it's the ultimate pleasure of life, the indulging in that type of unhealthy food. And he offers it to him. He says, you don't know what you're missing. And this person who eats healthy understands what unhealthy means. He's not tempted. Not only that, he cringes when he sees this other person digging his grave with a fork, literally to that degree. Why? Because since he was never exposed to any of that negative conditioning, there's not a chance he's going to cross that line. It's like somebody, years ago, people smoked. Many people smoked. And you never smoke because you understand the negative effect of smoking. And somebody, and years ago, they said, would you like a smoke? What was it, a cigarette? You say, I'm sorry, I'm thank you, but I don't smoke. Are you tempted for a moment to try it? You're not tempted. Why aren't you tempted? But the vast majority of society smoked in those years. Women used to smoke. When they ate, when they worked, when they relaxed, smoking continuously. People lived behind the smoke screen, literally. So the person who did this, why wasn't he tempted? Because he was never touched by that temptation. Therefore, he's not tempted. The Chofetz Chaim writes that speaking negatively about a fellow Jew, what we call Lashon Hara, where it has no constructive value, who's at fault? You know who's at fault? The parents. Why? Because as children, people are proud of the children when they speak their minds. Kid's a smart kid. You hear what he just said? He calls a spade a spade. He recognizes who that person is. And they think it's cute and they encourage it. That's part of development. You're allowing your child to develop negative qualities. Because unless if it has constructive value, your child should not say it. Because the parent never reined in on the son, on the child, boy or girl, or if a child didn't speak truthful, and the child was not reprimanded and taught to speak truth from childhood going forward, the conditioning already is negative conditioning. It's like a bent bone trying to straighten out a bent limb. Many years ago, I had a relative. He was the top orthopedic surgeon in Baltimore. His name was Dr. Greenstein. And he gave us, in those years, many of the children that were born, we're talking about in the 70s, they needed some kind of orthopedic shoe. Kids used to wear bars to straighten their feet out. They were pigeon-toed. They walked different ways. So he said to me, he says, in the 20s and 30s, all this wasn't necessary. In those years, in the 70s, he was a man about in his early 60s. He says to me, why? Because people, the nutrition wasn't sufficient. So the child in utero is in the bent position. So children, the bones already were, even in utero, were not flexible. Today, the bones are very pliable. And as a result of that, when the child is in that fetal position, the feet, if they're turned or twisted in a certain way, the child comes out with the feet are either pigeon-toed or whatever it is. Therefore, it needs corrective shoes, whatever it is. Once something is set, it's set. Sometimes you got to break a bone to straighten it out. Negative conditioning, you got to break the bone to straighten it out. So he says, the Chofetz Chaim, that the main responsibility or liability is on the parents, because the child only speaks Lashon Hara, or only speaks untruths or lies, is because the child was not reined in as a child. But if he would have been reined in, you don't have to fight your demons to suppress the temptation, but a person naturally would have no reason to speak negatively about another person. That's what it's all about. But unfortunately, that's not the reality. But a person who would raise his child correctly wouldn't be a consideration. It would be a lot easier, the challenges of life. The Rambam writes, the Gemara tells us, the Mokshe Bali Tshuva Omdin, Afil Tzadim Gom Einam Omdin, where a Bal Tshuva stands, even a person who's a tzaddik does not stand on that same level. Why? So Rambam explains, a person who initially wasn't observant, and he already has multiple levels of conditioning in the negative. Not observing the Shabbos, not observing dietary laws. So the person's conditioned to eat anything he wants. Time is his own time, or many areas of their life. And all of a sudden now, the person goes cold turkey, understanding it's not the right way. As much as you understand it's not the right way, but what are your inclinations? What is your conditioning? The conditioning was in all those areas. So that Bal Tshuva, the Rambam writes, continuously for the rest of his life, he has to fight with his demons to be able to do the right, behave correctly. A person who was raised his whole life never to violate Shabbos, never to violate dietary laws, and always lived his life within a certain conformance, he doesn't have to suppress anything. He naturally eats kosher. He doesn't have to suppress the temptation not to eat not kosher. He doesn't have to suppress the temptation of going in the car or putting on the light or cooking on Shabbos, because he never did. But the person who's the Bal Tshuva, that was the past of his life, he continuously has to contend with all these issues. It's a continuous life of suppression of conditioning, which is not in accordance, in conformance to what he should be. Therefore, the accomplishment of the Bal Tshuva to a certain degree has greater value than the accomplishment of a tzaddik for that reason. But don't think for a moment Baal Tshuva goes over to Rabbi Moshe Feinstein and says, you know something? I'm a greater tzaddik than you are. Moshe Feinstein, who openly said a secular thought never passed through his mind. His whole life was dedicated to Torah. You know, you want to sit and be acknowledged as a leading tzaddik of the generation. We're not saying that. We're saying there's an aspect of your level which even the tzaddik doesn't have that. But the tzaddik has his challenges to continuously advance the quality of his service. That's a challenge also. To push the boulder up the hill. He doesn't have to contend with challenges of a Baal Tshuva, but he has other challenges. Everybody has his challenges. Now, when does a person rebuke a person? You know, we speak about constructive criticism. The person, all he hears is criticism from the person. Never has any words of praise. So the person says, I never hear words of praise out of you. All I hear is criticism. So the person says, yes, but the criticism I give you is constructive criticism. That's its value. Moshe Rabbeinu waits to review the past right before he passes away. That's firstly. Secondly, it's after they already conquered the Trans-Jordan side of the Jordan, the territory of Sichon and Og, after he destroyed the two giants. Meaning the conquest has started. If Moshe could have reprimanded them, rebuked them before, why did he wait for this moment? Because if he wouldn't wait for this moment, you know what the Jews would have thought? Sure, he's always criticizing us. He's always reprimanding us. You know why? Because he can't deliver. Because why? It's 40 years, he hasn't delivered yet. Therefore, he waited that the conquest already started. They already received a major piece of territory on the Trans-Jordan side. The territory of Og and Sichon, which was grazing lands and so forth. Now he says, Moshe, knowing he's not crossing the Jordan, he says, now it's time to rebuke them, to give the Musar. Because now they see reality that it's happening. Now that it's happening, they'll be receptive to acknowledge that it's not just because I can't deliver, but rather it's because you have to hear this, not to repeat the mistakes of the past in the future. So it's a psychological issue. As I say, if you're only criticizing and you never showed the carrot, it's only the stick, you're going nowhere. That person's heading the other direction. But if you show the carrot besides the stick, and that's why the Talmud says that when you give Musar, the right always represents something positive. The left represents something negative. Even though the small is marachik, the left pushes you away. Simultaneously, the right should bring closer. It's a balance. You can't only show the stick. You have to show the carrot simultaneously. To show the person the value, and he has value even while you're rebuking him. The times we have to cut a person off. Because by showing the carrot, people say, you know, can have the cake and eat it. No. Sometimes you have to cut them off for a time to bring the person to his senses that you can't have the cake unless there's some degree of commitment on your side. So it's always the balance between small and yamin, the right and the left, and give enough right that the person should appreciate the value of the left. So you can't give too much right, you can't give too much left, but there has to be a balance between the two of them. And that's what Moshe Rabbeinu did. He first conquered the Trans-Jordan side and gave them to show the conquest as reality, and only then did he present the past as Musar. They should understand they shouldn't repeat the mistakes of the past and the future. I think we're going to stop here today, and I'll entertain any comments, and then we'll